Colleagues, good morning to you all. My name is Shanti St. Anthony, and I am the Knowledge Coordinator at the Pan-Caribbean Partnership Against HIV and AIDS. And I welcome all of you on behalf of our director, Dr. Wendy Emanuelson, who is online, but we're having some issues with audio, and she's unable to speak. So she has asked me to extend a really very warm welcome to you this morning. This is an important webinar for all of our stakeholders and all of our countries. And we also want to be able to say thanks to the Global Fund for working and collaborating with us in bringing this session to you. It is important because I think as we go forward, in terms of the HIV response, we're all aware that we continue to work in a resource constraint setting, and so sustainability is really very important as we implement our program, as we look at policies, programming for the response in the region in both Latin America and the Caribbean. Resource mobilization is important, and as we talk about activity-based contracting, I think that's really an important way in ensuring that there is efficiency, effectiveness, and economies of scales, not just through the Global Fund grants, but in all of our initiatives related to HIV in the region. And so again, I welcome you on behalf of PANCAP, on behalf of Dr. Wendy, and I thank the Global Fund and all of our partners for the ongoing collaboration in activities such as this, so that we can be able to advance HIV programming in the region and collectively take us to the achievement of our regional goals for 2025 as well as for 2030. And at this point in time, I would like to therefore hand you over to Maria Fernanda Alvila Ruiz, who is our first presenter this morning, and she'll take you through our slides. So again, welcome, and over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much to the PANCAP team for having set up this space, as well as the Global Fund for continuing to allow us to partner together in order to offer the best possible services for all of the region. We had a couple of slides that were going to be introduced by the Global Fund. We regretfully haven't had the opportunity of being able to share all of the audio capabilities to everybody on the call, so we do apologize for that. With me is my colleague Sofia. Sofia is an analyst at Instiglio. I'm a manager at Instiglio, and we would be the ones delivering the webinar for today. For the first part of the webinar, we'll have explanation of what activity-based contracting is. We're going to encourage you to use the chat for any questions that we'll have. We'll duly take notes of all of the questions, and then what we'll do is have a session at the end of the webinar where we can answer all of your questions and address all of the questions that you have on the chat. So I'm going to ask Sofia if we could please go to the following slide so that we can start the presentation. And maybe just to kick us off, the idea of activity-based contracting is one of the tools that the Global Fund is giving all of the different portfolios across the world. It's encompassed in the Global Fund strategy until 2028 in the idea of selecting the actors that offer the best value for money and allowing all of the countries to transition with a greater focus on resource optimization to give to be able to face better the different pressures that we now face when we're securing additional resources. The idea here on activity-based contracting is just one of the tools that would allow us to increase efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and sustainability. And we are going to be sharing today some of the key principles around activity-based contracting so that you can have the opportunity of learning about it, but as well as we can address each and any of the questions that you have. So if we go please to slide 4, Sophie. We are going to start with the objectives of the session. So for today's session, we're mostly going to be discussing activity-based contracting, as I mentioned. So the first thing that we are going to discuss is what is an ABC or an activity-based contract, what has been the scope of the work that has been developed in the region, what are success stories or what are key learnings that we've had in terms of how to deal with activity-based contracting. And then an additional objective of this session is to focus more closely on the different stages and components of a design and of activity-based contracting. So we are gonna be sharing some examples, also some key learnings that we've gathered over the last 2 years collaborating with the Global Fund here in Latin America and the Caribbean. So to start us off, the first thing that we want to kind of discuss is what is an activity-based contracting model, later on the components, and then the key learnings. But I think it's important that we are all up to speed in terms of what the messaging of an activity-based contracting is, and when we talk about activity-based contracting, what it is that we are actually referring to. So if we go to what the definition of an activity-based contracting is, it is very basically the agreement signed between the principal recipient or the service provider. There could be a results-based financing model between the Global Fund and the principal recipient. That is not the focus of today's conversation, but rather when the activity-based contracting is signed between the principal recipient and the sub-recipient. These are agreements in which the sub-recipient agrees to deliver a certain specific type of products or reach certain results contingent to the verification of those results. And once those results are verified, the sub-recipients then receive a price that was agreed upon before for those services that have been delivered. And this is a little bit weird when we're thinking of the traditional way in which we do work, but I promise it's going to become a little bit more clear as we look into examples. And a very good way onto understanding how this model is different from our past model is having a comparison of both models side by side. So when we're thinking about how we used to do stuff traditionally under the traditional model or the input-based model, there'll be a disbursement of funds from the PR to the SR, and then the SR would have to provide evidence for the acquisitions, for documents, they would have to provide invoices. This is a situation in which the fiduciary reporting is quite significant, and because it is significant, it doesn't necessarily allow us all the time to be 100% focused on the programmatic aspect of the intervention or on achieving results. So this is business as usual. This is how we usually work on grants, versus what is happening currently in some countries, and is that we are using the activity-based contracting models. So here is what is different, is that there is a disbursement of funds at the beginning of the intervention, and then what's happening is that the sub-recipients are achieving certain milestones, and then they're working on those milestones and they're providing evidence, and based on that evidence, then the sub-recipients receive payment for each of the results that they achieve. So basically we're shifting a model in which we are focused more heavily on inputs, which is traditionally how we work with, and now we're going to be focused more specifically on results. And we're going to go a little bit more detail on that, but one of the big advantages of focusing on results is that it allows us to actually deliver on the outcomes and ultimately deliver on the service for our key populations. If we look into the definition of the activity-based contracting and in general some of the advantages of having these types of models, you would see that, as I was mentioning, this model, as it is focused on results, allows for the programmatic to be at the forefront of the conversation. So we're going to be thinking about how to achieve those results, but also thinking about how we can shift maybe things during our implementation to get to those results. So it's not process focused, but results focused. And since it is results focused, it does allow for sector flexibility that is not possible when you have an input-based model. Since one of the things that is key for the activity-based models to function is that there is a specific evidence that needs to be presented, something that really helps is that there's going to be a reduction in the administrative burden for all of the parties involved. Because now sub-recipients are not going to be asked to present receipts or present documentation of each of all of the expenses, but rather to present very clear and succinct verification methodologies that were agreed upon when the contract was signed, and then the administrative burden is diminished across, because sub-recipients don't have to present a lot of information, but also the principal recipient will be focusing solely on the verification of specific pieces of evidence. If we look at other strengths of the model, one of the things that always come across is that it increases the possibility of all of the actors involved of monitoring the implementation. And basically how this looks is, since we are focusing on programmatic results and we have agreed upon the targets that we are going to reach and the way those targets are going to be verified, then what actually is going to happen is that we're going to be constantly thinking how to improve our operation and how to improve the way that we're working so that we get to those targets. So it shifts the monitoring between being super focused on receipts and super focused on the fiduciary aspect to actually being focused on the programmatic aspect and on the implementation. Since we agreed the targets at the beginning, and since we agree the prices, and since we agree the verification, it is also a system that reduces the risk of fraud. And in the way that it reduces the risk of fraud is because it is super straightforward from the get-go what it is that I want to achieve, what are the targets, how those targets are going to be verified, and what it is the price that I am going to pay for each of the targets that is reached. And in that sense, since we're shifting from fiduciary revision to programmatic revision, it does strengthen accountability because it is a very clear step, and this is probably something that's going to become clear in the next minutes of the presentation. It is super clear what is my responsibility as a PR. It is super clear what is my responsibility as a sub-recipient, and so I know that there are different steps that I need to follow in order for me to ensure that this system functions. If we take a step back, this is not a model that has been solely implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is actually a model that has been implemented across the world. The Global Fund has had the opportunity of developing activity-based models in different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course in Africa and in Asia as well. But just to give you a little bit of an example, this is a model that is not exclusive to the diseases that the Global Fund works with, but rather that has been developed in topics as divergent as migration, maternal health, diabetes. Actually, health is one of the sectors that has developed pay for results, which is a different way of calling activity-based contracting, to the forefront of innovative financial models that actually allow us to achieve results. And we're happy to share these slides so you guys have the opportunity of diving into the little context of each of the projects, but we just wanted to show that this is something that's been implemented for many, many years across the world. And if we double click to what it actually means for Latin America and the Caribbean, I just wanted to share that there's been a significant increase in the portfolios in our region that are using activity-based contracting. Instiglio has accompanied several designs in Honduras, in Ecuador, in Paraguay. We've also supported the revision of some of the designs that were developed by the Global Fund in Dominican Republic and in Belize. We developed a set of mini-grants in collaboration with PANCAP and with Alep a year and a half ago. Those are already on implementation. So there has been different stages in which we are currently at in terms of activity-based contracting. It's been an incredibly significant endeavor, and thus Instiglio as a Global Fund, we are incredibly thankful to many of you, I'm sure, in the call who have actively contributed for us to get to the place where we're at, where we're actively learning every day of the different designs that have been implemented in the region. So I think we, by this point, have fairly clear what do we mean when we say activity-based contracting. We also have fairly clear what are the advantages of this model, where it has been implemented in the world and in Latin America and the Caribbean. But a question that we often get is who gets involved and how does it actually look in real life? So activity-based contracting basically starts with the Global Fund and the country coordination mechanism, the CCM, who play a very important role in coordinating the preparation of the grant submission, have the in-country dialogue, and in general have these conversations around what are the priorities for a grant, ensuring that different actors are engaged, and including that different and diverse voices are part of the grant making process. After the grant is defined, that we all know our priorities, then the principal recipient comes in, and then the principal recipient receives both technical assistance and finance from the Global Fund. And ultimately, this is where the ABC comes in, and is the ABC being signed by the principal recipient with the subrecipients. So the subrecipients sign the ABC. They, of course, get selected. In many countries, this is part of a competitive bidding process, and many organizations that have not contracted with the Global Fund before are now actively participating on ABCs, which is another one of the benefits of this model, and it is that it is focused on programmatic results, organizations that can actually evidence in the selection process that they are the ones who offer the best value for money, they are the ones who actually drive for programmatic results, have a very good possibility of being selected, because we're not just looking now for organizations who have a very healthy fiduciary system, which is more often what we need when we are thinking of input-based modeling, but rather when we're thinking of ABCs, we're actually thinking of organizations who are very driven towards results, who work closely, hopefully, with our key populations, but as well organizations who are very flexible, eager to learn, and eager to grow. So our subrecipients, after they sign the contract with the principal recipient, they are the ones who provide the care for the beneficiaries. After they provide that care, they gather the evidence, again, evidence that has been pre-agreed and predefined when the contract was signed. And then the subrecipients provide this evidence for the principal recipient, so that the principal recipient can actively verify that evidence. And after the verification has been done, the principal recipient then disperses the payments of the verified results for the subrecipients. It's worthwhile mentioning that there's an actor that I haven't mentioned across the different map that plays a very important role where we're talking about activity-based contracting, and in general where we're talking about our grants, and it is the local fund agent. So the LFA does not play an active role in the verification, but rather in the context at the end of the year of the PUDR, they offer recommendations for the principal recipient as to how to make the verification more expedite, and in general, how to engage further with the subrecipients. So this was a very quick intro into activity-based contracting. I know some of you in the call have had the opportunity of having this intro before, where it be in person or in spaces like this. So we really wanted to ensure that everybody was brought up to speed before we started to discuss what are the different stages of designing an ABC. And before we dive into that, we wanted to invite you guys to actively interact with us. I know this platform not always allows us for interaction, but we wanted to ask a small question just to ensure that we are on the same page. So I'm going to ask Sophia to lead on this section specifically.
Great. So hopefully everybody on your screen, you can see a QR code for you to quickly access to a Mentimeter we have prepared for you, very quick. You can also go to mentimeter.com and just write down the code you see on screen, and that will give you access to our quick questionnaire. So I'm going to be sharing it with you so we can all see the answers together. Please, if anybody has any sort of trouble accessing our Menti, ask us anytime. Okay, I see some of you have joined. Let's wait a bit so that everybody can participate. Okay, so you can see that our question is, which of the following elements distinguish an ABC model from a traditional model? And I can see we have some participants. I encourage everybody to guess what our correct answer is. Well, with our participants, we can see that all of you have gone for answer D, which are B and C are correct, which happens to be the correct answer. So thank you for everyone who participated. And then we can go back to Mafe for the presentation.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you everybody who participated. I know it's quite early in Latin America and the Caribbean on a Friday, so I do appreciate all of you joining and actively participating on the webinar. So in the next section of this conversation, what we're going to dial upon is how to actually design an ABC. So we now understand how an ABC works, what it is, what the benefits are, but then how actually do you translate that into, input it into the grant, and having, of course, the conversation with our different in-country partners of what it means to actually design an ABC. So if we go to the following slides, Sophie, thank you. I just want to show you a quick overview of what the design entails, and then we're going to make a double click on some of the most relevant elements at the different stages. But again, this is an initial conversation. We encourage you all, if you have any questions, to note them on the chat, but as well to reach out to your FPMs, your specialists. The Global Fund is incredibly open to having as many conversations as you require in order to move the understanding around ABCs forward. So if we go to the next slide, Sophie, please. In the terms of stages, we have structured these on 4 different parts for it to be easier to understand. So these are the milestones that one needs to achieve in order to design an ABC contract. So the first one is to have a conversation around results. And when we're talking about results, we're talking about the first conversation of when should we start having this conversation, when is a good moment to start thinking whether I want to include an ABC on my grant or not, defining what are the programmatic and non-programmatic objectives of our ABC, building a results chain and kind of understanding what it is that I really want to incentivize, what it is that I want my SRs to be achieving, and then fine-tuning what it is or what are the results that I'm actually going to be paying for. The second part of this process is defining the evidence and the verification. And as we discussed on an earlier conversation, and as we discussed just recently, defining the evidence and defining how things are verified is actually incredibly important, because it is what is going to allow us to actually verify all of the results and have an understanding of what it is that we're actually going to be paying. So here is what is the evidence, what is the quality that I am expecting of that evidence, and then what's the whole verification process going to look like. Then the third is what is the payment structure. So now that I know the results, which was what I defined in point 1, now that I know what the evidence is, which was what I defined in point 2, I'm going to take a look into the payment structure. So what are my goals? What are my targets? What is the price that I am going to pay for each of these results? How often am I going to pay each of the results? And then how does the verification and payment structure speak to one another, so that I can ensure that throughout the implementation, there's ensured cash flow for sub-recipients. And then lastly, what I'm going to have is an analysis around risk analysis. And here is very interesting in sense of what are the risks in terms of programmatic and fiduciary risks that maybe the design of the ABC is entailing. So here is more of a conversation of, do I have to create risk mitigation strategies? Are those risk mitigation strategies under the manageable control of my PR and my SRs? Is this a conversation that needs to be had? And then how we set up our grant for success and how we set our ABC for success. So we're going to delve into each one of these. In case there are any questions, again, feel free to share those questions with us. So when we're thinking about results, as I mentioned, the first part is having an understanding of how is an ABC done and when should that ABC be conducted. So the question is not an easy answer in terms of when it should happen. It should happen as soon as possible. We've had, as you saw a couple of slides back, examples in Latin America and the Caribbean where we've started at very different points. We've, for example, accompanied the country dialogue in Paraguay, but then, for example, we started the ABC design in Ecuador when we were doing the funding request, and we started the design in Honduras once the funding request was finalized or on the final stages. So it really depends on the appetite of each of the countries. One of the things that's an incredible advantage of ABCs is that it needs to be tailored to the country. It needs to take into account the reality of each of the actors. It needs to be taken into account the capacity of each of the actors, but also the interest that the country has in terms of how do they want to move their response to the disease that they're tackling forward. And maybe something that I didn't mention before, or that I should have made a little bit more emphasis, this is not something that's HIV specific. Some of the examples that we're going to see here and many of the examples that I've mentioned are HIV specific, but we've had the opportunity of accompanying portfolios on malaria and TB that have also decided to design ABCs. So there's evidence across the board of being able to implement ABCs on the different initiatives that the Global Fund accompanies. Who should be involved in the design? So as you can see, the design does entail having a lot of questions answered. And here, as I mentioned before, it's really up to the country. We've had designs that have been led by the CCMs and the PRs. We've had designs that have been heavily supported by the FPNs and their specialists. We've had designs that have actively included the subrecipients. We've had designs that have not only included the subrecipients, but also going a step further, including civil society and community-led organizations. So it really depends on who the actors in the country is. It really depends on how the CCM is set and in general who's driving the conversation. But the encouragement is here always to think of what works in your country, what works for your portfolio, and to keep asking yourselves the questions: do we have the right actors at the table? Should we invite somebody else? Do we think that there's somebody's voice that is not being actively represented or included? And then make sure to bring those people in. So just to wrap up, in general, the main takeaway is that an ABC design does need to be adapted to the specificities and needs of each of the countries that are going to be adapting it. That it's very important to encourage open participation and constant revision of who's at the table and how we're making the decisions that we're making. So we heavily encourage you to, regardless of whether you're on your grant making process, to think through this and to think when it makes sense for my country, if it makes sense or not for my country to switch to this innovative financing mechanism. Then the big question always comes and is what it is that I'm going to be paying for. So what are the results? What it is that I'm going to be incentivizing? And then defining results is not easy. We often encourage to include both products and activities and always have a mindset of thinking, are the things that I'm going to be defining under the manageable control of my subrecipient or not? And for the selection of results, there is often a process that we follow and is defining the programmatic objectives of the contract. These are always very much in line with what the programmatic objectives of the grant are. The second one is defining the results change and then following a set of criteria that I'm going to discuss in a couple of minutes, arriving to the results that I want to incentivize. So just to quickly double click on each of these three steps, when we're talking about the programmatic objectives, we want to ensure that those are aligned with the country's priorities. We definitely want to ensure that those are aligned with the performance framework. We definitely want to ensure that those are aligned also with a revision of past country performance, and in general, that they do convey an understanding of where the country is at and where the country wants to get, because that's definitely what we want to incentivize in the model. So once we finalize our objectives or ensure that those are aligned with the objectives of the grant, the next step is to then map the results chain. And I know this is an exercise that many of the organizations here in Latin America and the Caribbean have done before, and is actually think through what are the different steps that I need to go through, or what are the different steps that I usually go through in order to achieve a result. So here we are having a very active conversation around what are my activities, and then how those activities need to be prepared, and then how the preparation of those activities actually gives me outputs and then outcomes, and then the incredibly difficult conversation of what is an output, what is an outcome, and where do things fall more clearly in the results chain, and then how those things cascade onto impact. So here it's a very significant encouragement of including as many voices as you can, of ensuring that actively people are being consulted, and that where you're thinking of the different stages, you're thinking of those stages in alignment with the programmatic objectives of the grant. So now that we have our objectives, we've mapped the results chain, we know where we're at in terms of our activities, What comes next is defining actually what are the results that we're going to be incentivizing. So the criteria for selecting those results is pretty straightforward, and it always goes back to the reflection of what it is that I want to get out of this grant, what it is the results that I want to pay, and it's ultimately the question of what is my definition of success. What is my definition of, if I achieve this, this means that the grant has done an amazing job, that we've reached all of the targets. So that's the first thing that we want to look at. The second thing is, actually, this thing that I'm looking at, is it under the manageable control of the subrecipients, or is it maybe not 100% under the manageable control? And since we are incentivizing subrecipients, we always want to ensure that things are under their manageable control. The third, is it easy to understand? If I read it, if Sophia reads it, if any of you in the audience read it, would we all have a similar understanding of what it is that we're being asked to do? And if not, then probably wording needs to be a little bit better, because it's very important that we understand what we are tasked or asked to achieve. And then finally, does this minimizes or not any additional risk, or am I creating negative incentives by establishing this new system? And this is a question that will probably keep on popping up, because it is always very important when we're reflecting of shifting to this new model, if that's the decision that the countries decide to take. Am I making a smart choice for my country? Am I making a smart choice for my portfolio? Is this actually something that's going to help my sustainability strategy, and it's actually something that's going to build the ecosystem of CLOs and CSOs in my country? So this is a pretty straightforward system that we use. And maybe just to close the definition of this first section on results, something that we heavily encourage at Insiglio is to choose two types of results. So results that are more tied to activities, or more close to this part of the left of your slide, that are very easy to achieve, easy to verify, that are actually going to allow the organizations that are acting as subrecipients to receive funds very early on in the implementation. And then those that are close to impact, that are actually the indicators of the things that we want to incentivize. And the reason why we think it's incredibly important to have both sets of results is because the ones that are closely tied to activities are actually going to allow us to have funds distributed easily to the SRs and on a promptly manner, and those funds are going to ensure that you keep on delivering on results. And then the ones that are closest to impact are the ones who actually are going to move our targets forward, or are actually going to ensure that we fulfill the targets that we want to fulfill. So that was, I know, a very fast and broad description of what we've done in terms of results, but I just want you guys to bear with me. We've now gotten to a point where we have of results. So I know my objectives, I know what I need to do to get my results. I know those results are under the manageable control of my SRs. I now have my results. What comes next? Well, what comes next is having a very intense conversation and an amazing conversation of, okay, now that I have my results, how do I actually verify those results? Is there documents or databases or national systems that I can tap into to actually provide an evidence that I have actually done the work and achieved those results? And then if that is the case, how should the verification happen? Should I, as an SR, send a database to the PR? Should the PR revise national databases? And this is going to look different depending on the country you are. There are countries in Latin America that have a very advanced and integrated national health system that allows for a lot of the information that we use around the 3 diseases to be centralized, but then there are others who are not there yet. Hopefully, these types of models are going to sway us in a direction of having more data that we can use to make more informed decisions. But for those countries, the possibilities are endless. You could have databases, you could have surveys, you could have spot checks. Again, this is one of those things that depends heavily on the maturity of your country, the maturity of your portfolio. So as we had criteria that we use for the selection of results, we now have criteria that we use for the selection of evidence. And the reason why we have this criteria is because probably we'll get to a point where we have two really good evidence that we could use for the same result, but we would actually want to get to the one that's better and that's actually going to convey the message or convey what it is that I'm actually looking for in my results. So in terms of criteria, we have these four. So the first one is that it's reliable. Since the verification is a process that's going to happen more than once and that needs to happen fairly fast so that, again, we can ensure cash flow throughout the implementation, it needs to be a data point that is reliable. If I look at this, I know 100% that it can be trusted and that all of the risks that could have happened have been mitigated. The second one is that it is sufficient. If I had really good reliable sources, but then I have 5 sources or 10 sources, then it doesn't really get to the point of it being fast, so it needs to be sufficient. Is this the only thing that I need to look at? And if not, do we do these 2 or 3 data points, do I get a sense that the service was rendered or not? It needs to be efficient. Does it take a lot of time and effort and money and resources in general for the subrecipient to create this evidence? Am I asking a lot of the subrecipients or not? And then, is it relevant? Does it actually convey the objective? Is it clear? Is it logical? Does it have a direct connection with the results? And then we're constantly asking ourselves this question because as we really made an effort to choose the best possible results in line with the objectives of our grant, we now want to choose the evidences that are closest to the definition of those results, that are actually going to allow the PR to verify that the service was of the highest quality, but able to verify it in a way in which we can actively receive the payments of those things on a timely manner. So again, we have our results, that's great. We have the evidence, what comes next? So what comes next is actually defining how this is gonna work. So in terms of the steps, this is again, very high level steps. This does look different country to country, but in general, what happens is that the subrecipients deliver the service and then they prepare the evidence based on the agreements that have been made around how that information needs to be organized, whether it is a database, whether it is uploading to the national health system, that again varies country to country. And then the second step is that the PR takes that information and verifies the information. And one of the things that needs to happen where we're also deciding on the evidence is deciding what it is that the PR is going to be looking at. So for example, if I have a database, is the PR going to be looking at the name, the country, the city, the date? What are the data points that specifically the PR is going to be looking at? Because if we have clarity around it from the get-go, that means that the SRs know what the verifier is going to be looking at, the PR knows what they have to look at, and so the whole process is just going to be a lot more faster. And then the final step is once the PR has verified the results, they are going to disburse the payment for the subrecipients after they've completed the verification process. And then I just wanted to pinpoint again that the LFA does not conduct the verification in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the countries that are focused countries, because that's how things are laid out. But in countries who are not focused, but maybe core, it would look different. That's one of the things that, again, going back to the point of these needing to be country specific, needs to be clarified and allowed for each of the countries to evolve in their own. And just to offer a very quick example of how this looks, we've mapped our change of results, and then we arrived to a result where our result was the number of individuals who have undergone HIV testing on a defined period. After we looked at the different evidence possibilities, we identified that a database produced by the SR with several information and then the HIV request form were the best way to go to verify. Again, this is an example. And then what we did was that we described specifically what that evidence meant. So it's a digital database created by the SR that includes XYZ information, or then it's an HIV request form that's a physical copy that includes the name of the person who's receiving the HIV test, the total of tests performed, and the name of the person who conducted the test. This, again, varies country to country. There are some countries who have these fairly standardized, others who are in the process of standardizing it, and it looks fairly different, but it's just for the sake of the example. So now that we have the evidence and the verification process clear, we're going to move on to the third part of our design components, which is the payment structure. So on the payment structure, the very first thing is to define what our targets are, what the goal is. Now that I have my results, what it is that I want to achieve. How does that look by year? How does that look by region? And here we are heavily encouraging all of the countries that start doing ABCs to align that as much as possible with the performance framework. The performance framework and the grants documentations are the guiding principles for all of the activities that are going to be implemented on our grants, as we know. So it's very important that the language that we discuss around activity-based contracting, as it is part of the grant, actively includes the logic of how I am actually going to fulfill all of the targets that I have on my performance framework. Another very good reference is let's revise historical performance. Have historically sub-recipients, for example, in test delivery on, or in general in any part of the chain delivery X results or set results. It's very important to also have a reference of what is actually the country being able to deliver on. And finally, being super clear for each of the results. What are the results that are expected yearly? If they vary from region to region, if they vary from SR to SR, if they vary from key population to key population, those are the things that need to be defined. And it's important that we define them at this point, because ultimately when we start the implementation, these are usually the things that allow for spaces of doubt. So we want to be super clear in the process of designing. Then once we have our targets, the second the second step in this part of defining the payment structure is deciding what the payment unit is. And this is a little bit of a weird concept, but I promise it's going to be super clear. And it is the payment. Am I going to be paying for tests? For example, in the example that we just saw, am I going to be paying for people who receive the test? Am I going to be paying for number of trainers that I train? Am I going to be paid for the number of training spaces that I offer? So it's very important to define for each of the results what it is I am actually paying for. And this is super important, because when I've had an understanding of what it is that I'm actually paying for, I can then pass to the next step, and is what is the price that I want to pay for that. And to get to the price, there has been an incredibly different array of opportunities in LAC to learn from. There are some countries where there has been a shadow budget done in close coordination with the PR and with civil society organizations and community-led organizations. There have been other countries who have used the budget of the grant to kind of follow an understanding of what it is and what the price is that actually reflects the cost of achieving those results. So there's a lot of experience across the region of what's the best way forward in order to get to the price. And here again, we heavily encourage you to engage your FPMs. We heavily encourage you to engage your specialists, even spoke with peers that have already implemented. Probably Honduras is a great example in the region of what a country very close to many of you that has already gone through this process. So understanding what were their learnings throughout the process would be incredibly useful. And then finally, what we're going to be defining is how often am I going to be paying? But not only how often, but am I going to be paying the same for everybody? That means the same price for all the different regions, or the same price for all the different key populations. So there's a consideration that needs to be had and conversations that need to be had. And again, this is something that looks very different country to country. So just to bring us up to speed, up to where we are at, we're going to share with you an example of all of the different elements that we've just discussed brought together. And this is something that we call the verification and payment schedule. So what you'll see is that you have a result. This result, as we mentioned, was heavily aligned with the program objectives, was heavily aligned with the objectives that were defined of the grant. Then you have results that reflect the intention of the performance framework. Those results have defined targets, and those targets are defined if they're divided by region, or if they are divided by sub-recipient or by key population. You also have an understanding of what the targets are. Those results, they have their targets. You also have an understanding of what it is that you are actively going to verify for each of those results. And then lastly, you have an understanding of how much you're going to pay for each of these results, but also when you're going to pay. So this is where it all comes together, and we're actually going to see, okay, here I pay an advance payment, which is something that has also been included in many of the examples in Latin America and the Caribbean, because we understand that starting to get results is very difficult out of nowhere, that the organizations that are going to be implemented do need initial funding to start getting those results, and then we reconcile those results at some later point on the year. But basically here what we're showing is we have that initial payment, then the organizations deliver on results, they aggregate all of their verification evidence and they give it to the PR, then the PR does the revision following the guidelines that were already discussed and defined, and then the PR disperses the money to the SR following the verification process, contingent of course to the actual verification happening and the results according to what was agreed being achieved. And this happens through the entire year, and that's why it's very important for all of us to be super mindful of what are our responsibilities. So again, if I am an SR, I know I have the responsibility of delivering results, but also of preparing the evidence in the way it's been structured and it's been discussed. To the final point on our designing components, and is having more of a conversation around, throughout all of the different things that we've defined, what are the different risks that may arise. And it's very important for us to have this constant revision of, is this model actually going to aid me to get and fulfill the performance framework? Are there things that maybe am I not considering? Are there things that have come up that I have not defined? So it's very important here to be very mindful in the understanding or the analysis of those risks. So we basically in ABCs classify risks around two things. These are not going to come as a surprise. First, we have the ones that are linked to programmatic things, and then the ones that are linked to fiduciary risks. So the ones that are programmatic, they're fairly straightforward, and it is anything that jeopardizes the services that the subrecipients are delivering to the populations. So for example, there was not access to reliable information systems, the verification couldn't happen, information was not available, people couldn't really reach the key populations. Those are all programmatic risks. And then fiduciary risks are when there's a financial deficiency or the misappropriation of funds, or maybe the verification happened, but then the disbursement of the money didn't happen. So everything that touches financially the system, those are fiduciary risks. And why are we having those conversations now? We're having these conversations because what comes next after we've defined our results, our evidence, our payments, and now our risks, that we're going to draft a contract and we're going to list with as much detail as possible all of these different elements so that that contract can be our path forward and the card that we're going to use moving forward, so that we're all on the same page of how things need to get executed. What rights do I have as an SR? What responsibilities do I have? What rights do I have a PR? What responsibilities do I have? So this is a point where I look back at my entire design and I revise, does this decision create programmatic or fiduciary risks or not? And if so, how can I mitigate those risks? So this is a very important part, because this is what's going to finalize our design, that then, as I mentioned, is going to be summarized on a contract, and that's going to actually allow us to speak the same language and have the same understanding throughout the 3 years of implementation. In following webinars, we're going to dive a little bit more deeper into the context that we've seen before. We're going to have a little bit more discussion on the different elements. This is just the first snippet of activity-based contracting, and we're going to have for sure a revision of the different tools that have been developed in coordination with the Global Fund on how to make a design, how to ask these very detailed questions, how to look at the criteria that we saw for selecting evidence or for selecting results, how to create a risk registry, and how to ask ourselves, is this a programmatic risk or a fiduciary risk? Or what things should I take into account when I'm having the conversation of, is this a model that I want to implement in my country or not? So there's an incredible amount of tools available. We'll dive into those on a next webinar. But before I close and open the space for any questions, I just wanted to close with some parting takeaways of the model and of the system, and maybe share with you a little bit what the experience has been in some of the countries. So in terms of the elements of an activity-based contract, I think we can go back to something that we discussed at the beginning in terms of what are the key characteristics of this model, and this is a model which flexibility is heavily encouraged. This is a model which is focusing on the key populations, in the sense that ultimately what is going to be the driver of the decisions is what are the results that I want to achieve, what are the targets, and how I can better serve my key population. It's a model that actually enables all of the different actors involved to develop their capacity further, because now we're not going to be thinking as much on the inputs, but rather on the outputs and on how that can create results. So that's a first important component of the activity-based contracting that we learned today. The second one is that since this is indeed a model that needs to have the revision of a lot of different actors and need to include the voice actively of different stakeholders, it does require a lot of collaboration. So it's going to promote a lot of interesting conversations. Sometimes those are going to be challenging, but the importance is for all of us to bear in mind that we want to create a system that actually serves us and aids us and actually allows us to have a better understanding of how to serve our key population, but also how to achieve the targets from our performance framework. So it is a system that actually encourages a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different information to be included. One of the third things that we learned today in terms of ABCs is that the outcomes and the activities that are chosen are incredibly important. So there needs to be a lot of conversation around what are the results that I am going to achieve, but then also think of results that are easily achievable so that we can ensure cash flow, but then results that actually move the performance framework on the right direction. So it's incredibly important to align around those. It is a system that does require a lot of revision around what our prices are, what our targets are, and how our prices are actively going to reflect the cost of implementing, and how those prices are actually going to be a show of all of the different resources that need to be inputted into achieving those results. So it does require a revision of our historical performance, organizations sharing what has been their experience of actually implementing programs in the context of the work with the Global Fund, and as having a very important conversation on how to move from a system that we've been using for many, many years to this system. So it is a conversation that needs to be had around, in general, the financial model. Then, in addition, it is a system that requires a lot of responsibility and commitment from stakeholders. So it is incredibly important for us to address the fact that we do have to fully commit, in the sense that I have a set of responsibilities. For example, as an SR, or the PR has a set of responsibilities. So it is incredibly important that we are constantly reflecting on those responsibilities. It is also a system in which we can actively ensure that, since we are now going to be focused on results, that we're actually going to be not only achieving those results, but also, since we've defined a very clear specific criteria for verification, we're actually going to be gathering a lot of inputs and a lot of information. And while we're doing the verification on a timely manner, that's actually going to give us a lot of great sources and great inputs for our countries to think of how to improve our grant proposal for the next year, and then how to include things that maybe we hadn't really mapped out, or that we had identified but we didn't really have the data to actively include. So it is a model that actually allows us to have a lot of information. Finally, it is a model where the key criteria is to signal and summarize everything on the annex, and to ensure that we actually have on the annex all of the information that can help us guide the conversations that we have in the future, or have like a very important understanding of what are my rules and responsibilities, important understanding of what the results are, what the targets are, how the verification process is going to happen, how the payment process is going to happen. And then finally, it is a system that promotes, as I mentioned before, a lot of new information being included. It is a system that promotes that we learn as a country and are constantly reflecting on how to move things forward. So that's basically the presentation and information that we had for you today. Before we dive into questions and we give space to a lot of the new presenters that are going to come in for the second part of this webinar, we wanted to ask a small question. So I'm going to quickly pass it on to Sophia, and then we can move on to the discussion part.
Amazing. Thank you, Mafe, for that presentation. So we have another interactive exercise in which we have another small question for the audience. So again, you can scan the QR code you find on screen, or you can also go to mentimeter.com and use the code that you see on screen, 73004603, so that you can see the question that we have for you prepared. So we're going to wait for participants to join on our last exercise. If anybody has any sort of trouble joining our last Mentimeter, please reach out. So you can see that the question is about our results chain and what is its function. Okay, let's wait a few more seconds to see if anybody else wants to join. Okay, so thank you for the ones who participated. So we can see that the correct answer is actually D, which is A and C answers are correct. So the function of a results chain is to choose the outcomes to incentivize within the ABC contract, and also to understand which activities and inputs are necessary to achieve the contract's objectives. So thank you for participating, and back to Maf.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you for those who participated. We just want to open it now for the audience and for gathering any questions. I see now that both Delphine and Julia and Mercedes and Wendy are here as other presenters, so I would encourage you to actively join and share, please, any questions, concerns, or comments that we have. We're very eager to listen to all of those and support you in the best way that we can moving forward.
If I can just come in, good morning, here's Wendy. I just want to be sure that those that, if there is a question that participants are aware of how to ask a question, they can have it. Richard, so maybe you can give the instructions so that everybody knows how they can ask the questions. Is that fine?
Yes, Miss Wendy, thank you very much. I guess there is a chat that you can type your questions in. So feel free to type your questions in the chat because all the participants are muted. So you can just ask your questions in the chat and the presenters will see and answer. Thank you. Also notice there's a questions portal. So if you go in it, I see Joel Simpson has asked a question here. In some countries like Guyana, the principal recipient is reluctant to contract CSOs in the traditional way. Does the ABC model provide an opportunity for the Global Fund to drive meaningful involvement in the affected communities in the country grants? That is a question coming from Joel Simpson.
Thank you so
Okay,
much,
thank you
Joel,
for
for
that.
your question.
Maria,
Go ahead,
did you
Wendy.
get it? Maria, did you get it, or you want Richard to repeat the question?
I did got it, and maybe I'd venture to respond, but then I'll encourage both Julia and Mercedes and in general the colleagues from the Global Fund to respond. And I'm just going to share a very brief example of where we've seen that actually happening. In Honduras, there was a competitive bidding process and different organizations organized consortiums, and within those consortiums there were many organizations who were CSOs and CLOs who had never partnership before, who had never accessed fund for the Global Fund, and the ABCs allowed for a system in which we are, again, as we are looking for the organizations that offer programmatic results and the best value for money, they were the ones who brought that to the table and they were selected. And then maybe another good example is in Ecuador. In Ecuador, both subrecipients, because they had been selected by the time the design started, were actively consulted throughout the design. So I would jump back in and ask the colleagues from the Global Fund to respond, but I think in general, as it is a system that allows a lot of flexibility, it is also a system that allows a lot of different and diverse actors to be brought to the table. But again, it falls into what the country's interests are and priorities are and how actors are actively engaged.
Thank you. I take my cue. Thank you, Maria and Maria Fernanda. Maria Fernanda and Maria Fernanda. No, there is an issue with the names down there. Anyway, thank you. And I'm Julia Perron. I'm the regional manager for Latin America and the Caribbean. So I also take this opportunity to thank PANCAP CARICOM for organizing this webinar, to Insticlio for delivering it, and to all the participants that showed interest. Yes, the short answer to the question is yes, or at least that's one of the main reasons why we are open to ABC contracts, because there is a sense that for governments to take over social contracting, one of the main obstacles is the little visibility under an input-based model of cost versus benefits and administrative barriers in paying CSOs cost inputs without having clear link with the outputs. We see that ABC contracts are a more promising way to push for social contracting. So we cannot guarantee it. Of course, it will depend country by country, but that's precisely our hope, because it allows us to also create a better evidence of the added value of civil societies, of the competitive costs at which they can continue to offer services to hard-to-reach populations. The additional reasons why we want to do this is to increase cost effectiveness, and not less important, to reduce reporting burden for both you, the LFA, and the Global Fund, which in turn allows, we hope, to pave the way for a broader range of CSOs that can be included in social contracting. We want meaningful participation of communities. We know that under an input-based model, bigger organizations are the ones that tend to win contracts because they are the ones with stronger accounting systems that can report to Global Fund. With an output-based model, I think it's easier for smaller NGOs to get to participate. So I think that's it. Maybe a final word regarding the fact that We are not pushing for this as a solution to all evil. We have started in Latin America countries, mostly Spanish speaking, in a few countries. We are not enforcing this. The idea is if countries are interested, we are open to have these discussions. We know that in the funding request of Jamaica, they have included an ABC component, or they're going to include an ABC component. It's very important that we monitor how it goes, that we adapt depending on findings. So we are on a learning trip together with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Joel Simpson. I hope that answers your question. He has another one. He says, are there services or projects for which the ABC model is not appropriate? Are there services or projects for which the ABC model is not appropriate?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I maybe can take the lead on that one, and my colleagues can complement. I think it's a question around the maturity of the country to take on this responsibility. And I say responsibility because, as we've seen, there's a lot of things that need to be discussed, and hopefully a lot of actors that need to be brought to the table. But in complete honesty, what we've seen in the countries that we've worked with is that it's actually a system or a way of understanding our responsibilities and our priorities that have moved the PRs, encouraging, and of them being insightful of where they're at and where they want to go, and they've actually allowed for their development of different, in general, has been incredibly. Can you see me now?
Now we can see you and hear you. If you can please repeat, sorry, and we will complement. Thank you.
I don't think we can hear her.
You are not
No.
hearing you at all.
No, but if I can then complement, hello, and my name is Mercedes Garcia. I'm the specialist in sustainability, transition, and co-financing from the Global Fund. I think that if I can follow the intervention from Maria Fernanda, what we need to keep in mind is that the model is flexible. It's not about what or where we implement the model, but how flexible and how able to adapt to this model. It's a change of way of working. So it's more about how the system is appropriate. I don't mind, Fernanda. How the system in the country is able to adapt, and also how the different stakeholders are able to understand their role and responsibilities, Maria Fernanda was mentioning, but also are able to implement it in this way. Maria Fernanda, if you can continue.
Yes, thank you, Mercedes, for jumping in. I'm sorry, guys. I'm dialing from Nairobi, and internet's not really good here for some reason today. So yeah, I think in general, what we've seen is that this is actually a model that has allowed the PRs and the SRs to develop further and to learn a lot from the process of designing and the process from implementing. So it really comes down to whether each of the actors are definitely wanting to move to a model mostly close to inputs, to a model closely tied to results, where, as Julia was mentioning, there is a possibility of engaging new voices, bringing new voices to the table. It is a path forward onto social contracting. So as we're having these conversations around sustainability and around what's going to happen in the next grant making cycles, I think it's worthwhile having the discussion amongst us to see if this is something that makes sense. But what we've seen is it's actually been incredibly useful for both PRs and for SR. So I wouldn't say there is a good moment or a bad moment to start. I would just encourage you to open the conversation and make a revision with the different actors in your country to see if you're there yet to start implementing. And kudos to Jamaica for being in the process of including this on their grant making process.
Joel, I hope that answers your question. We have a question from Daniel. He asks, what are the recommendations on how can stakeholders contribute or ensure compliance with the common legal or technical requirements of the ABC design and implementation? What are the experience cases in other countries?
For sure, that's an amazing question. Thank you so much. I think you really nailed it down to what it gets included in the annex to the contract. So as I was mentioning during the presentation, this document is what summarizes all of the different elements that are defined for the design. So it'll have a very clear understanding of what the results are, what the targets are, what the verification process is going to look like, what is expected of the evidence from the SR standpoint, but also from the PR standpoint. So we really want to ensure that the document includes all of that information so that we start implementing, we can reference back to that document and ensure alignment with the things that we define. So that to answer the second part of your question, and then to answer the first one part of your question, I think something that we saw a lot participating on the grant making process for Paraguay from the get-go was that it's really important to encourage the open participation as much as possible in the country dialogues. I think the CCM there did an amazing job of bringing a lot of very diverse voices, different organizations, both CSOs and CLOs, including at some point some actors from the private sector. So there was a huge encouragement to include new voices. And I think as soon as we decide to start having this conversation, and the earlier the better, because for example, the grant making process, specifically the country dialogue, is a very good moment in which we can actively start engaging those newer voices and start defining what it is going to go into a grant, and then consequently what it is that I am going to include on my ABC. So I would just encourage you to reach out to your CCMs. If already chosen, reach out to your PRs, and if you are actively interested, reach out to your specialists and reach out to your FPMs, throwing the ball back at Julia and Mercedes in case they want to complement. But I guess down to the point is, it's just incredibly important to leverage the actors that you have available.
Thank you very much, Maria. There are no other questions.
We don't hear you, Wendy.
We're not hearing you. We're not hearing you. We're not hearing Wendy at all. I'm not sure what has happened, but are you guys hearing me? Okay, great. Let's wait and see if Wendy will come back in.
Can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. I don't know why. But anyway, sorry about that. But thank you so much. I will not put on my camera. I'm not too sure if that is affecting the internet. But thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the participants online and a great question. But a special thank you to the Global Fund, because of course Global Fund is assisting the countries. And please allow me to ask Julia if she can still give us a response, a reaction. And Julia is the regional manager for Latin America and the Caribbean team. And it's always very nice to have her in our meetings, in our webinars, as she is a great support. So Julia, please address us and react to the presentation. And I know that you certainly would like to share maybe more of the technical support that is available from the Global Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and really not much to add to what I said before. Again, I would like to thank PanCap for hosting this webinar, and we believe that we should leverage more this channel to organize joint webinars and also work more actively to ensure active participation. We are, of course, available for any country-by-country discussion, so you can reach out to your country teams, and there are further resources available, and we can count with the expertise of Instiglio that has very competently supported us already in several LAC countries. So if needed, we can also request their assistance. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope this has been useful.
Thank you for that. Also, thank you, Maria, and your team. I would like to thank Dr. Shanti and Richard for their excellent support and filling in where it was needed. The webinar is recorded, so we will send those, especially that those who are not able to attend, we will share the link with them. And if there's any questions, we are happy that you are still available to address them. So thank you again and have a wonderful day. Back over to Richard. So Richard, please make sure that you do the closing the way it should be done.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. I would like to thank Maria and all the rest of the team from the Global Fund for this most insightful presentation. It was really edifying, and we're really thankful for you for presenting it. As Wendy said, we're going to share the link. I'll put this video on our YouTube channel. So I'll share the link with all the presenters who weren't able to make it today. Also, a PDF version of your presentation will also be distributed to all the registrants. So those who were not able to participate will also be able to gain some knowledge about the ABC guidelines. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have an amazing day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.